Hello, this is Tyler Henson in the registrar's office coming at you today to talk a little bit about last date of attendance and source documentation. There's been a lot of questions about source documentation as it relates to LDA. So hopefully this will help you understand it a little bit better as I go through a PowerPoint that is also available on our website. So what is last date of attendance? LDA, as it's commonly referred to, is the last date in the semester that a student was engaged in an academically related activity. Really, we should be thinking about this as last date of engagement because with especially online classes where there is non-attendance, what we're looking at is when is the last time that the student really was engaged in that course. So as you can see by our examples here, they were virtually or physically attending a class. They submitted an assignment, they sat for an exam, they participated in an online discussion board or even contacted the instructor to ask about the academic subject. So those are some examples of how you can define engagement. And LDA is asking for the last time a student was engaged in the course. Now, this is not a new requirement. We've been asking to report LDA for many years at MTSU, but hopefully this helps clarify what we're looking for when we ask in final grading, what is the student's last date of attendance if they did not pass the course? Now, when is LDA reported? Well, we do a couple of different reportings throughout the semester. As everyone knows, at the beginning of the semester, you're required to report attendance or engagement in the first week, 2 weeks of the course. And typically this time you're just noting if a student's not attending at all because there hasn't been enough time to really establish that a student stopped attending. You're not submitting any documentation for this, you're just reporting whether a student is attending or not on Pipeline. And so that's at the beginning of each semester or each part of term if you're teaching a smaller part of term. You can also submit during the semester updates to attendance reporting, and you could submit with your midterm grades if a student has stopped attending. But that beginning of semester report is required. Now, at the end of the semester, when you submit final grades in Pipeline, you are required to submit a last date of attendance if you have a student who received a failing grade, or if a student has an incomplete grade and the default grade behind the incomplete is failing. We need to have that LDA reported at that point, even if it's an incomplete. So that way, if a student does end up failing, you don't have to go back and remember what that LDA was. You can go ahead and report it now while everything is still fresh. So you have to report a last date of attendance for students who failed the course. If those students were not initially reported as never attending, and if the students didn't receive a grade of W or NC. So when you go to final grades and you see that they have a W, you don't have to report that last date of attendance. So when you're submitting final grades, you have to submit an LDA for students who do not pass your class and don't meet any of those other caveats. Again, this is not a new thing that you have to report. So you're looking back at your course, at your semester, and you're saying, okay, when did that student last become engaged with the course? And that date is what you use for LDA. Why are we reporting this? Well, in very simple terms, we have to for federal audit purposes. Collecting LDA has been required at MTSU for many years. It's not a new practice. However, some recent guidance has led MTSU to also require gathering source documentation for the reported LDA, and that's just to be in full compliance with federal requirements. So although LDA is most often tied to financial aid, it's important to note that it's a requirement to collect for all students, regardless of whether they are a financial aid recipient or not. Veterans and international students, they also have to have attendance reported for their purposes. So reporting LDA is important for all MTSU students and not just students who are receiving financial aid. So reporting LDA, reporting the last date of attendance, is one piece you have to do. In this past year, what we have started collecting now is the source documentation for that last date of attendance. And what I mean by the source documentation is simply a copy of what you used to determine the LDA reported during final grading. So if you're teaching a spring class and you had a student that submitted an assignment in March and that was the last time you heard from the students, let's say you go to your grade book and you have a due assignment there and this date, and you can see that was the last time the student was engaged. That's, I'm assuming, the LDA you're reporting. What we need is a copy of that documentation so that we can see where you got the date from. It's really that simple. The problem is sometimes you have to go back and search and try to find where that date is. And so you should be undergoing practices that will let you easily collect that documentation for the end of the semester when you have to submit this source documentation. So again, you're looking back at the end of the semester, you have a student who failed. You look and see, okay, what was their last date of attendance? You take a screenshot of what you're looking at. You submit a copy of your grade book, of your attendance sheet, whatever the case may be. And that's what we need for source documentation. Now, if you don't have documentation, let's say you don't take attendance, you're not sure when a student actually stopped engaging. We do have an option where you use the midpoint of the semester for the last date of attendance. And we always give that last date of attendance midpoint during final grading. That's part of our calendar on Pipeline, the term due dates calendar. So you can see what that midpoint is. You can use that midpoint if you don't have documentation to properly determine what the student's LDA is. When you do that, you don't have to submit documentation. The midpoint is enough and sufficient to report, but it is better for students if we do try to report their correct last date of attendance and provide documentation for that for a variety of reasons. But it really does help a student out to make sure we're properly reporting when they stopped attending. So how do you go about gathering that LDA source documentation? Again, it depends on how you're making that determination of when a student stopped attending. If you're using D2L, you can use the class progress tool to show when they last had a discussion post or a Dropbox submission or a quiz. One of those things, you can take a screenshot of that. It's important to note you're not just taking a screenshot of the last time the student logged into D2L, because that doesn't determine engagement. That just means they logged in. So you take a screenshot of the last thing they submitted or did in order to be considered engaged in the course. If you keep a grade book that includes dates of an assignment, or you can submit a copy of your syllabus along with that grade book to show when assignments were due, that can be considered documentation. If you keep an attendance sheet, which of course we do not require attendance to be taken at MTSU, but some instructors do take attendance in physical classes, you can submit that attendance records that clearly shows when a student stopped attending. You can use an email between you and the student if you're talking about something regarding the course, not just a student saying, hey, I'm not coming to class today. That's not really engagement. That's them not coming to class, but an email with a date, or you can document a phone call. If that phone call is the documentation that you have, and it was about part of the course and not just the student calling to find out what their grade is in the course, or, hey, I'm not coming to class today. So emails or phone calls for turning something in late or inquiring about extra credit are not considered substantive course-related activities. That is important to note. But any of these things can be source documentation. There's a lot of different options out there to gather that. Now, once you have that documentation and you go to do your final grades, you submit that documentation through a form that's on Pipeline. And you can see through the screenshot here, this form is right under the final grades link called last date of attendance activity source documentation. Now, eventually we're going to have this integrated with final grades to where you don't have to have a separate form to submit for your source documentation. Unfortunately, it's just not ready yet, but we're working on that. We do know it's a little cumbersome to go out there and submit this form separately. But after you submit your final grades and report your LDA, please go back to this form and submit your documentation. You'll submit one form per CRN where you had an applicable LDA to report on. If you didn't report any LDAs for a course, you don't have to do the form. Or if you only use the midpoint dates, or you only had students who never attended, you don't have to submit that form. You only submit this form if you had an LDA reported that requires that documentation to be submitted with it. So what are some best practices for reporting LDA? There's just a few options. I won't go over all of them. But if you are doing an in-person class, obviously an attendance sheet is a very easy way to keep up with where the students are attending and engaged in a course. Grade books are very easy things. What is important to note is whatever you're reporting, whatever you're using for source documentation, please note that it works best if you submit a PDF, but there are a few other file types like JPEGs and Word documents that we can accept. Excel spreadsheets do not upload, but you can convert those Excel spreadsheets to a PDF first. So please make sure that you're sending in supported documents whenever you're sending in source documentation. That will help us out tremendously. And again, how are we trying to make this process less cumbersome? We're working towards updating the final grades page to where you can submit your source documentation at the point that you are submitting final grades. So there isn't that extra step. I don't have a date when that's going to be available, but we are working towards it. And it is, this is going to be a requirement forever, as far as we know. And so it's best to go ahead and get in the practice of submitting this documentation now through that dynamic form, so you're prepared to provide it when we do integrate everything with final grades and pipeline. So go ahead and get into that good habit of finding that source documentation every semester. If you have questions, I have an FAQ page out there where you can read some commonly asked questions and see some tips on how to collect screenshots from D2L. Contact your department chair. They are there to help. Contact Dr. Cheryl Torsney in the provost office, or contact myself, Dr. Tyler Henson, if you have questions. Any of us are willing to help you out, trying to figure out how and what to submit. And we are definitely wanting to try to make this process as easy as possible. So if you have questions about best practices or something you can do to easily collect source documentation to go along with your LDA, please reach out and ask. We are here to help. Thank you so much, and we appreciate you helping us out as we try to meet these compliance requirements.